Centurions are cool. Who doesn't like the idea of taking super soldiers in powered armor and equipping them with additional layers of ceramite and loading them up with an arsenal of heavy weapons? The concept itself isn't bad. Similar to the Hulkbuster armor, up-armored Space Marines are definitely cool in theory, but in reality, the models for the Centurion are odd. They are scaled a bit too small and have quite a few odd design choices that don't help the overall aesthetic. However, this creates a fun hobby project for us enthusiasts. And as an added bonus, it does correlate with the Primaris wound paradigm that I illustrated in my previous video. But I digress. It's time to get these guys across the Rubicon. Let's build Primaris Centurions. In following the brilliant producers of cooking shows, I have 2 of the 3 Centurions already built, so you can get a preview of the end result. I have broken the process down into 10 steps, but before I begin breaking down the parts I'm using in this epic kit bash, I want to give a shout out to Reddit user Lazarus Crusader, who brought this possibility to my attention via his post on Reddit. I will add a link to that post in the description below. And I'll be following his process loosely, making a few key deviations for my Prometheus pattern Centurion plate. The first step will be to build the torso of the Centurion. Once it's cured, I'm going to cut the portion that houses the bolt gun / missiles off. As Lazarus Crusader points out in his post, that design feature makes no sense due to the proportions of the miniature. Since the arms pass through that space, it leaves no room for the firing mechanisms to exist. So we cut them off, and then fill the open space with your large surface gap filler. The end result looks like this. I'm also doing this step first because the polyfilla does take some time to harden. And the last task of this stage will be to attach the backpack to the Centurion's torso. Step 2. Leg assembly. Next, I'm gonna do some pretty severe surgery to these legs. The task will be to take the Centurion's knees with their attached servos and affix them to our intercessor's legs. Here I've started with one leg already. I snipped the intercessor's leg as close to the top of the knee joint as possible. Then, on the Centurion's legs, the first cut will be on the foot harness, where we want to cut it as clean as possible to the point where the foot rests. Then I cut the Centurion leg at the top of the knee in the same manner as the intercessor was cut previously. Now we cut the foot of the Centurion off at the point where the servo joint ends. When doing this cut, try to be as perpendicular as possible to the Z-axis of the tibia. And the result is the extracted servo joint. Next, I'm going to cut the intercessor's leg so that we can affix it with the servo. What I have found is it's usually this area here, marked by this line on the back of the leg. However, since this may have some variance depending on the exact models used, I would recommend working your way down towards that point, dry fitting as you go, because we can't undo any mistakes. Try to make these cuts perpendicular as well. Once the sizing is correct, it's time to put this Marine back together. First, glue the servo joint to the intercessor foot, and at this point I will also glue this combined piece back onto the Centurion foot harness. Before gluing this leg back onto the intercessor's body, you'll need to wait for the glue to cure a fair bit, so you may as well repeat this process for the intercessor's other leg. Once both legs are built out, they can be attached to our intercessor's body. My process here is fairly organic. After gluing the first leg, I cross-reference the proportions versus a spare reference intercessor. Once things look appropriate, I continue, but I'm happy to adjust all the glue points as the full pose becomes clear. Then once both legs are cured enough to at least hold their positions, we can get this guy up and mounted on his Centurion feet. The feet have these notches on them to ensure they only sit flush in the orientation designed for the kit. So depending on the pose of your intercessor's legs, you may need to remove that notch in the foot socket in order for the Centurion feet to match the natural pose of the intercessor. At this stage, you may find there are some gaps in the joints of the leg surgery. If that's the case, use some gap filler like liquid green stuff or something equivalent. What I'm using here is some old sprue bits mixed in with some plastic glue. Step 3. Attaching the torso. The next step in the process will be integrating the work we have done so far with the Centurion body. To start, we're going to cut the intercessor's torso from his legs above the belt. Then we'll clean the surface of his waist and slice the button off his belt buckle so it's smooth. From this point, the Centurion torso should sit fairly well on our leg assembly, so we can dry fit to determine the best orientation for our pose. After that, I'll apply some glue to the inside of the Centurion's belt and place it on the model in the desired orientation. Then, we let it dry. Step 4. Prepping the leg armor. Time to return to the legs, specifically the leg armor. What we need to do is separate these armor panels. Our Primaris Centurion is significantly taller than the chunky boy that comes in the kit, and is also potentially more dynamically posed, so we need the freedom to place these panels as desired. To separate the panels, use your knife and carefully begin cutting using repeated controlled slices over the seam. The ankle joint is especially thick, but the technique works fine, it just takes a bit longer. Also, take additional care when cutting the hip plates apart, as you don't want to ruin the pieces during the separation. It's a little tricky, but slice along the angle of separation. If you do it correctly, you get all 3 pieces just fine. Step 5. Clavicle armor. Heading back up to the torso, we are nearly ready to attach the clavicle armor. But first, we need to trim the excess bits. Because we removed the armpit-mounted Hurricane bolters, a large portion of the hydraulics and these armor flaps are unnecessary. So we're going to snip them off, but keep those pieces aside because we're going to reuse them in extending the leg hydraulics. Who doesn't like efficiency in conversions? If you like efficiency in conversions, hit the like button now. And with the armor cleaned up, we can glue the clavicle armor onto the torso. Alright, I need to level with you guys. During the editing process, it dawned on me that in filming this 3rd Centurion, following the build order I established during my first 2 experiments, I encountered a flaw that was absent from the first 2 builds. This was likely caused by this 3rd intercessor's pose being the most different than the base model of the 3rd Centurion. And while I feel I worked through and solved the challenge in a satisfying way, I realized that if we change the build order, it prevents the issue from occurring altogether. So as we proceed through this video, from this point it'll appear as though we've skipped portions, but rest assured we will work our way back to them. Step 6. Leg hydraulics. Based on potential variances of the different Primaris poses, it's best we start here. It's immediately obvious that these are too small for our Primaris Centurion, but we can extend it with our clavicle pieces from step 5. The goal here is that we essentially want to attach the hydraulics to our Centurion with the pieces as designed, but deviating as demanded by the pose. At the extremes of customization available, we have 4 cut points to adjust the articulation, as you can see on this previous squad member, where I used all 4 pivot points. So let's start with one leg at a time. Start by cutting the hydraulic right where the downward extension begins from the knee. This cut is mandatory because we know the arms are already too short. From here we can dry fit the arm to the knee, and we can see how our components can orient. Ideally, the joint of our clavicle extension should line up with the round detail of our intercessor's ankle. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I think it's a neat design detail that has some functional credence. Again, depending on the demands of your pose, you may need to cut or adjust elements of the build to get things to sit in a manner that looks functional. Then you just repeat this process on the other leg. And with both sides complete, we can finally affix the butt plate to the hydraulic rig. Step 7. Leg armor attachment. Keeping in mind we have already done the hydraulics, it's time to affix the armor plates. To start, the toe plates can go on as is. Like everything we've done with the legs previously, we have to account for the underlying pose. Let's start by applying the thigh and shin plates using a small amount of plastic glue. And we can take advantage of the time afforded by the longer time plastic glue takes to cure. And from here we're gonna jump right to the ankle plates. I'll start by attaching the plates we cut off from the clavicle armor to the sides of the ankle, covering up the exposed space, and position it so that there is room for 2 subsequent panels to be added using plasticard. I am by no means an expert in using plasticard, but I find it's pretty easy to get an adequate result which will look good if you work procedurally. What works for me is performing a series of dry fits and reductions to the plastic card until I get the target shape. Then I attach it in place using plastic glue. By shifting the build order as I've done with steps 6 and 7, it allows for the shin plates of the armor to be adjusted closer to the application of the plastic card for the ankle covers, resulting in a smoother build process which removes any undesirable surprises. Once all 3 panels of the ankle are done, I like to add a few additional stripes on top to make it feel a bit more detailed. And once you have done this for both legs, all the legwork is over and done. Step 8. Attaching the arms. As a bonus detail, I'm using my hobby knife and a sculpting tool to create some grooves on the hand and arms to add some detail. I feel this small effort goes a long way towards improving the design and getting rid of the dreaded Centurion mittens. The first step for reattaching these arms will be to dry fit them into a desired pose. This may require some trimming of the hydraulic details of the arms. Test the dry fit of each arm with the shoulder pads as well. And at this stage, if you're going to build a back-mounted Hurricane bolter, then you also want to make sure that the arm bracket fits during the dry fit testing. Once the pose is decided, pin the arms for the orientation. I'll be using some paper clips. Then once the pin is dry, drill an opening into the Centurion torso for the pin to rest inside. And add some super glue to the pin, and sock it in your arms, and give it a few minutes to cure. During this time, I'm going to attach my secondary weapon bracket. Next, evaluate and determine if your Centurion arms require some gap filling, which may or may not be the case depending on your arm's position. The next step will be to make some green stuff for our shoulders. Once your yellow and blue stuff are mixed, ball up 2 chunks and place them above the Centurion's shoulders, and then press the shoulder pads into position and let that green stuff cure. What this does is create a larger surface for the shoulder pad to rest upon, which is somewhat necessary since we cut off the clavicle hydraulics. Step 9. Attaching the head and waist plates. And now with the pose fully in place, I will attach the model's head in a manner that suits the pose, and attach the waist plates into a suitable position. Step 10. The Hurricane bolter. The first step is prepping the Hurricane bolter itself. Cut the bolt rifle just before the left-hand grip. Then separate the assault bolter magazine from the firing mechanism and glue the mechanism onto the rifle. Then detach the other bolt rifle magazine and attach them end on end. After that, I'll pin the small Necron Gauss blaster barrel into the center channel of the bolt rifle. And I will glue the drum magazines into position underneath the firing mechanism. Then after that, I will build out the storm bolters, removing each one's mount and handle. Now the bolt rifle should be ready enough, and we can begin creating the triple orientation of the storm bolters. Each storm bolter is glued to the central rod, and glued to each other along their corners. While that cures, I'll build out the servo arm mechanism. Using the Necron Praetorian back, I will snip off these orbs and a suitable length of the autocannon barrel. The plan here is to attach the pieces in this orientation, creating a sort of ball and socket joint. Now it's time to connect the gun to the arm. Since the arm is mounted far away from the center of balance, it'll droop as it glues, so be mindful of this and MacGyver a support structure to prevent it from drooping as the glue sets. Then, once it's dry, I will add the plasma incinerator scope and the hotshot lasgun cables. Because I magnetized my Centurion weapon points, the Hurricane bolter's center of balance causes it to swing and potentially come off of its mount. Because of this, I am applying a pin armature to the bottom of the weapon. And the build is done. It's quite an elaborate conversion, and despite the bumps I had along the way, I feel really good about the end result. Comparing it to the model as designed, the Primaris proportions read far better, and is closer to how the Centurions are depicted in the artwork, which is a big plus for me. With that said, thanks for watching. This video was a ton of work, but I wanted to do something special in appreciation for hitting 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please give it a thumbs up by hitting that like button. And as always, subscribing is the best way to support this channel and help it grow. Thanks so much for watching, have a great day, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.